Hey painters, welcome back. Today's video is going to be pretty cool. It's got a lot of different facets to it, so stick around to get the whole thing. We're going to talk about the Zorn Limited palette. We're going to talk about how to add the Zorn palette to the color picker in Artrage. A little bit of technical thing there. It's very easy, but still something that helps to have a tutorial for. We're going to talk about why I chose this color palette and why I chose this painting to do with this color palette, and we're going to talk about how I do it. So we've got some technical, some conceptual, and a bunch of other things to talk about. So let's jump in and see where it goes. This is the Zorn palette. You've seen it, you've heard about it, you know the artist, and you know these colors: the white, the black, the yellow ochre, and the cad red. That's kind of a contemporary version of the Zorn palette. And using these four colors, the artist was able to create some massively wonderful paintings. We're going to talk about how that works. But before we do that, let's look at how we can do that. Look in the bottom right-hand corner. We have the color picker tool. If we right-click it, right in that active color area, we can select color picker from disk, which lets us load any JPEG into that space that we want to. And you can see then as I select a color, there's just a little slider that lets me change basically the value of that color that I select. But it gives me a nice display. I have made this custom, perfectly fitting JPEG, and I'm going to drop it on my Patreon for my Patreon supporters, but I'm going to keep refining this down and get that and a bunch of other sorts of, like color picker, custom color picker JPEGs for people to use for various projects. So that's step one, setting up your UI. And I just wanted you to see how easy that is, especially if you're pretty good at Photoshop and you can create your own, your own custom stuff. But the other thing I wanted you to know is that with this Zorn palette, I was on this forum the other day, the Draw Makes Paint forum, and someone did a really nice job of making a color wheel using the Zorn palette. And so they mixed all these colors by hand, and then I started reading all the posts on this forum and a bunch of others. It was really informational, so go check it out. Really, really cool stuff. Helpful to talk about, what blacks, what whites, what reds, what yellows, how they're different compared to the historic colors, and why we might use one thing or another. And so if you're a traditional artist, a lot of fun. If you're not, still a lot of fun. But when we transition that to digital, I'm going to basically have two things that I'm going to use. One, in the bottom right-hand corner, kind of hidden by my references right now, is my color picker, which is with my custom Zorn palette. And then I'm going to use the Zorn color wheel, provided for free by the really kind artist on the forums. And then I'm just going to start with a lay-in, and I'm going to color sample everything from the color wheel. Not one thing gets color picked from my reference image today. So I'm just going to do a little sketch. I've started using the watercolor tool for my sketch. I just like having something looks a little more watery, a little bit more fluid in my underpainting. It's the way I work when I work in oils, and I just kind of continually try to find something that, I don't know, feels more familiar to me in that arena than I don't know. People have their own ways of working. Mine, I'm always trying to harken back to my training as an oil painter. So I like the watery nature of the watercolors, and I like the loose sketching that I can get with it. And it's nice. It just works really well. Basically with this portrait, I was just looking for some big shapes, trying to figure out, looking at negative space, how close are the lips to the edge of the cheek? What's the gap between the eyebrows? What's the length of the nose? And look at the shadow at the bottom of the nose, and then measure that up to maybe the inside of the eye and that shadow where the tear duct is, and just kind of looking for those big landmarks on the face, looking for how much face is there between the eyebrow and the hairline, how much space is there between the eyebrow and the hair that's falling down on the side of her face, how much hair is there above that wreath, and just kind of everything is relative to everything else. I'm looking at those proportional relationships, looking at negative space, looking at simplification, keeping things really, really basic. I like working fast through this kind of thing, and I like to be analytical, but I also like to push myself to go quickly, because then I won't get stuck or mired down into too many details. And you guys know that about me. I think that's a very helpful way to work, is to keep things really, really simple. Now I want to get into blocking my color using my oil brush, and I'm often tinkering with the sliders on Artrage's oil brush, and basically I'm just going to go in and start to find the local color. And this is a really, really important lesson, is that, in a lot of the work that I do on the channel, I'm very focused on like getting accurate color, or like color pick from the image or whatever. But it's not that important. That you can go through a gallery or great canonical works in Gardner's Art Through the Ages, or any of those big textbooks you read when you major in art history at university. And you'll see just tons of great examples of portraiture with non-realistic or not representational color. You have like a ghoulishly green or purple face, but the portrait reads right, and that's because the value is accurate. So what I would like you to try to do, if you're interested, is squint your eyes down like crazy so you lose detail, focus on values for whatever your reference image is, and just try to match value in your color wheel selection. So basically, if I'm looking for a dark value, or like, or here in this case, like kind of a lighter value above her eyebrow, I'm going to squint my eye down and try to find some semblance of that in the color wheel below. Now, this color wheel isn't perfect because there are vastly more color possibilities that you can get from the Zorn palette than these. And there's some of the really high key or light values that are missing from the color wheel. So there's some problems with my setup for sure. And I just didn't, slow down enough to kind of work through that. But for me, it was good enough. I think that these high saturation colors were working towards my ultimate goal, which was to do some abstraction in the color, not like a radical abstraction, but just some exaggeration abstraction. So using the Zorn palette, I knew I was going to get some nice color harmony, but I also wanted to play with saturation and brightness and intensity and paint myself kind of away from using the accurate local color. But I wanted to make sure I would hold as close as I could to the values that are present in the reference picture. And that way my light will read, even if my colors are a little bit imagined. And that's something I want to encourage in you is that playfulness with your colors. It takes the pressure off if you don't have perfect color, but just to focus on the one thing, which is to have accurate value. And the way you can figure out if you're nailing it is just squint your eyes down till you're losing all detail, and just try to read the shadows and read the highlights, read the midtones, read the shapes of those things, and just try to find an analog of whatever the value you see is, not the color, but the value that you see is in that color wheel. And you can get this color wheel from the Draw Mix Paint forums that I grabbed it from. Artists put it up there free to use. So I was like, hey, this is great. But you don't have to. You go make your own. Go down and grab four tubes of oil paint and do some experimentation and make your own color wheel or your own color swatches. You can get pages of these things. So it'd be pretty fun to see what you all come up with. But when I'm laying in color like this reminds me of back when I was in university. We had this professor who made us paint every night. We had to paint ourselves. It was obnoxious. Like, I never painted a self-portrait before because it just isn't all that interesting to me. I'm not like, I don't have a ton of pictures of myself or anything like in the world and on my desk or in my house or anything. And so I was just like, okay, well, all right, we do it, right? I figured eventually we would have a different project, but it was basically our nightly homework for the whole semester. Not only was that expensive for, the starving college student to be buying that much oil paint, but you kind of got to a point where you just ran out of ways to make yourself interesting. And so I remember one night, it was always late, after everybody got to bed, I was like, I finally got to start painting this portrait. And I did what I'm doing here. And it wasn't until I was halfway through this painting that I realized, hey, this is like that thing I did in college. So what I did back then was lay out all my tubes, not according to their color family, but according to their value. I set out, and I just kind of made a value rainbow, basically all my high key and then midtone and then darker values. And I just kind of mapped it out. And I put them on the palette in order of lightness or darkness. So I just kind of had a totally different palette, totally different arrangement, and painted in a pretty dark room. So I couldn't really see my color mixing very well. I was just looking for those big blobs of out of the tube value basically. And where I saw darks on my face, I grabbed dark values from the palette. And where I saw midtones, I did the same, and so on and so on. And I painted the whole painting with as much pure out of the tube color as possible, using value as my guide, not color. So I kind of ignored color, pretended I was basically colorblind, and just used light and dark. And it was really impactful. It was punchy and graphic, but it was authentic. You could tell it was something that had coherence because the values made sense, the painting held together, but the brushwork was rapid and bold, and the color design was really just atypical because of the kind of logic I used to do the painting. And that's a little bit like what I'm doing here. I wasn't as, didn't have as much bravado in my setup as I did back in university. This I thought would be more of like a nice limited palette experience. But the concept is the same, is that you're not trying to get accurate color so much as you're trying to get accurate value. And using that limited palette, you may have to approximate to a degree, because you might not be able to reach exactly every color with the mixing that you have kind of at your fingertips, but that can work in your favor. This reminds me of the way I start some of my design courses with intro students. A lot of the time we start with incredible limitations. The students are only allowed to, and by the way, if you push H on the keyboard, if you're working on PC, you can flip the canvas horizontally. And if you push V on the keyboard, you can flip the canvas vertically. And that just helps. A lot of times, like, I'm painting late at night and I'm super tired. My brain's like half asleep. And it helps me see if I have drawing problems and where they are, just to kind of freshen your view of the piece. But going back to the intro student thing, a lot of times when I'm working with intro students, I force them into crazy limitations. So we do a project, for example, where they have to express the words public, private, human-made, organic, order and chaos. Yeah. And then they're only allowed 4 black 1-inch squares, and that they arrange on a 6-inch by 6-inch canvas. And they're not allowed to rotate. They're just allowed to position the 4 squares. And they have to evoke these 6 different concepts: public, private, order, chaos, and so on. And how do you do that when you just have arrangement? We're trying to talk about the most basic things in art. And that's how we always start. I always have students come in and they say, the thing is you're not learning to draw, you're learning to see. And so let's start seeing with the most basic tools. Because if you can figure this out, then just wait till you learn to draw, right? You're going to be able to conquer the world. So we start with these simple tools, these simple practices. We do a ton of exercises where we're trying to look for the simplest solution. And we use really simple shapes, really simple colors, really basic everything. And I love working like that because it reminds me of like when I would design practice plans as a coach. We were always trying to create games that simulated the game of soccer, so that this mini game could teach the actual game, which in and of itself is just a metaphor for life. So we have this we have all these different layers, right? And so as an instructor, you're always trying to come up with these strategies of limitation to focus people in on the right things, which if you've watched like my video about heavy paint, that's one of the things I really admire about that tool, is the built-in structural limitations that, the designer keeps adding features, but I kind of wish it would stop, because on the one hand, as it functions right now, you don't even have the option of it not being highly restrictive. And I really love that, right? It's kind of getting so advanced that that's not, it's good. It's great that it's advanced. Now, Artrage, for example, is powerfully advanced. So you have to be sort of the one to set your own limitations. And in this case, when you limit color, it helps free you up. And I think especially for those of us that are a little bit more like, oh, I'm a realistic painter, or I'm a realistic artist or whatever. Those of us that are maybe more academically trained, there are academic solutions to help us find abstraction. And there are academic options for us to kind of work our way out of the kind of coordinates that the academic training has given us. Sometimes the naive artist is better at experimentation because they haven't learned what they're supposed to do, right? And so some of us are, that's why I do like a intro to Artrage, or intro to painting, or intro to digital painting, or intro to whatever. I have to be careful that I don't become too confident of this is the way, because as much as we can say this is the way, there's always a counterpoint, right? And so that's kind of why this video needs to exist. It's for at that point where you've painted 50 sunsets and forest paintings and your grandchildren and whoever, or your best friend or the dog or whatever, and you kind of get to this point where you're like, okay, now what? What's next? And that's the point at which you get to actually start to have real fun. But you need a little bit of coaxing to move out of that comfort zone of color selecting, painting accurate referential imagery. How do we find then a little bit more personal voice? How do we find that color isn't just describing light and temperature? It's also expressive and emotive and highly abstract. And so this is one way of getting at that. So it's a fun and liberating solution, an academic solution, saying I'm going to use a limited palette to real art problems. And so I just think that that's really valuable. The other thing I think that's valuable is getting away from always using the color picker. If you're an artist that always uses the color picker to grab imagery or to grab tone and to grab color from your reference picture, that's something, again, to work on, to say, you know what, I need to branch out. I'm going to try some plein air, or I'm going to try some this, or try some that, or I'll use a color wheel or whatever. Just find some different strategies for not always using the color picker. Because with digital, you have a lot of cheats, and there's nothing wrong with that. Even traditional artists use cheats, they use grids, they use all kinds of things, right? And there's a lot of things we could talk about that could fall into that category. But what you want to think about is not so much what cheats or whatever, or even to use that terminology. It's not super helpful. What you want to focus on is to say, what do I want to learn, and how can I accelerate that, or how can I deepen that? How can I hone in on that learning that I really want? And for me, just personally in this moment as I speak to you, is that I have been going through almost like a chapter is closing, a new one is beginning. For a long time, I've kind of been working along the same path, painting kind of bold brushstroke portraits. And while that's great, and while I love it, it's not why I'm on the earth, right? I didn't get popped out of the earth and born so that I can paint bold brushstroke portraits. I often feel the work I want to do has yet to emerge. And I have all of these little hints toward that. And while I'm working on that and kind of banging my head against the wall, of course I'm going to keep at it with some portraits. I love that. Of course I'm going to keep at it with some figurative work. I love that. Of course I'm going to go paint some plein air landscapes. I love that. I love all of it. But I'm still, as I'm doing all that, I'm digging in, and I hit ruts and I get stuck. And I've been stuck for this whole month of May and June, just stuck. And I was thinking, I need to find just a different approach. And this was a simple but really wonderful different approach. I just had to sit down with a limited palette, and it just freshened up my portraits. It just freshened up my painting experience. It helped me simplify in a way. It helped me reimagine and kind of taste painting again for the first time. And it's not a super complicated thing, you know, like, I mean, you can give yourself little challenges. Like, what if for a week you just paint whatever you paint, and in any of the subjects that are in your paintings, you just outline with complementary colors? I mean, what if you did that with lemons and you outline them in violets, and you paint some apples and you outline them in green, and you just play with different strategies that maybe some, I mean, what I said, that thing about complementary colors, I mean, it's like so dull as to be like, not even like a, you know, but you could imagine that becomes a thing. People are so funny about artists' work, you know, that you become known for whatever random abstraction that you decide to lean into for your body of work. You know, I'm like, oh, that's the complementary color guy, or oh, that's the atmospheric guy, he always pushes the atmosphere, or oh, that's the guy that always uses really saturated non-local color, or that's the guy that just paints really obnoxiously huge paintings with epic brushstrokes, or oh, that's the guy that, you know. And there's so many different little shticks that artists get known for, and then you kind of get pigeonholed. So I don't particularly like that pigeonholed part of it, but I know that there are ways to find your own voice. There are ways as a new artist, a beginning artist, a mature artist, an experienced artist, to find and to keep discovering that voice. And so in order to do that, I think experimentation is pretty key. I mean, there's a lot of good conversation to be had about how we find the work that we need to be doing with the canvas and with the brush, right? And for me, it's definitely going to be figure and portrait in some capacity, but where does my love of science fiction and fantasy fall into it? Where does my my just kind of constant affection for like Frank Frazetta fall into it? How does Frank Frazetta and his illustration marry the brushstroke and bravado and painterliness of John Singer Sargent and the crazy expressive work of Ashley Wood, or the thought-provoking paintings of the name slipped out of my head. I'm going to do a focus on her in my next video. But there's just so many things that I'm always trying to like bring together, and but the only way I can find those spaces, and the only way I can kind of get into that place where these things start coming to life. Number one, I have to paint a lot. And if I get myself adrift and I can't kind of figure out what I'm trying to do, I start to feel stuck and stifled, and things feel boring. So then you have to find different ways, different strategies to enliven it for yourself. This is merely one, but the advantages here are the color harmonies, the unique color schemes, the way that you can stop focusing on getting perfect color and be liberated there a little bit. And in so doing, you can focus on other pieces of your painting kind of repertoire, right? You can focus on brushwork, you can focus on value, you can focus on the development of the different planar surfaces on the face, making sure your anatomy is accurate. You can challenge yourself to make sure that with the distorted color, you're getting perfect value. You can focus on all kinds of things. And this is just, again, like I said, one way we can do that. And I'm going to keep after it and keep sharing a bunch more ways, but I thought this would be a fun way to start. I always like flipping the canvas here again, and I have some distortions to the portrait, but as you saw in the beginning, I just kind of threw down my sketch pretty fast, and sometimes you pay the price for that, but you know, it's digital, so what are you worried about? You can always like cut, paste, stretch, pull, do all kinds of things with it. It's not set in stone. You know, like a traditional portrait painted in oils. I remember I had this 3 foot by 3 foot portrait of this girl's like sleeping with this sharp, you know, like low light December afternoon is what I call it. Light coming in the window, that kind of end of the afternoon in winter feel. And I painted one brushstroke wrong, and the nose just, boom, it just shifted. And there was like, the nose was just in the wrong place by about a ½ inch, quarter inch. So I had to wipe the whole thing, start over. It was like 30 minutes of work. But with digital, you just Control Z. Who cares? You know, it's like be free, be reckless, be crazy, have fun, don't stress. And that's, that's another learning for sure, is how to paint free, how to not have to tickle to death every last little thing as you got to render it down. No, don't do that. Don't do it. Just, let your paint strokes have some voice. And you don't have to, just doesn't have to be too much, So a lot of rambling here, but I think there's a lot to learn. As you can see, as this painting comes together, it has a really strong semblance of the colors that are in the reference photo. And there's a lot of great colors in that reference photo. And one of the things you really have to decide is, how are you going to handle your shadows and highlights when it comes to warm and cool? I remember one of my favorite paintings. I walked into my mentor's house, and this was down outside of Taos, New Mexico back in the day. And he lived on a lake down there, and his house was full of the most beautiful paintings. And there was this large one that was right in the main room, and it was of two ballerinas sitting on a bench, either before or after their training. And they were like putting on or taking off their shoes. You couldn't quite tell, but I remember it was very intriguing to me, because if we read it left to right, on the left side of the painting, it was pretty much just a complementary color scheme, red and green, red in the highlights and greens in the shadows. Oh, and let me tell you real quick. So I did have a little drawing problem with the mouth. I didn't like the placement. I wanted to move it. So all I did is grab it with the selection tool, which I've done tutorials of that before, and then copy pasted it, and then slipped it over just a little bit to the left, and then I just merged the layer down. So you can kind of play that in slow-mo if you want to see how to do that. I've also done that plenty in other tutorials. But yeah, so that's just a quick little aside, talking about, I talked earlier about, taking chances, making mistakes. It's okay. It's digital. It's easy to fix. So going back though, so on the left side of the painting, the highlights were these warm reds, really warm reds, cadmiums, and just really had these like tints of orange in it and stuff. And then the shadows were these cool greens. But as you move across the painting, those highlights, those reds, became cool red highlights, and then the greens, the shadows on the right side of the painting, became warm greens. And so that maybe gives you a framework for thinking about it. Do some experimentation. Typically, I like to have one or the other be warm and cool, right? You can have cool highlights and warm shadows. You can have the opposite, right? That's the norm. But see what happens when you start switching it up. What happens if you switch it up in the middle of the canvas? So on the left side, it starts with warm highlights, but by the time you get to the right side, it's cool highlights. And then you do the same thing with the shadows. You invert them by the time they get, from the left to the right. Interesting things you can do. A lot of ways to challenge yourself. A lot of ways to play with the basics. The grammar of the work. I mean, of art. And I don't want to say grammar and like turn you off to the whole thing, but there's like this logic. There's like these structures, these like foundational pieces of being an artist and making art. Usually on the first day of my classes, I stand up on the desk or I stand up on a table or wherever, depending on what we're teaching, and I just wiggle my thumb, maybe my left thumb. And I'm just standing there on the desk with my thumb wiggling, and I finally just say, "Where are you looking right now?" And it takes, a little bit of a confidence student. The first thing, nobody knows you, it's first day. And they say, your thumb? And you're like, yes. And as soon as you understand that, you understand your power as an artist. Your role is you're going to be the attention guider. And that's what you're doing. So we can do that with color. We can do that with value. You can do it with shape. You can do it with texture. You can do it with scale and proportion. You can do it with placement and perspective. You can do all kinds of things as an artist to direct the viewer. But you have to start to be able to play with your tools, your tool set. And one of those tools is color. And a limited color palette is a really fun way to play. So I'd be very excited to see what you come up with. If you feel scared about tinkering with, maybe expressive color on a face, paint some fruit, paint a still life, paint a landscape, something that you feel like confident enough in that you're not going to be worried about quote unquote messing it up, try that first and see where it takes you. But if you're like me, you love what you love, and I want to work with a figure. I want to work with portraits. I want to work with that. So for me, I was like, this can be fun. And I love it. I love the weirdness of that color, the different colors in the garment down in the bottom, the painting. It's just so bizarre to me, the way that all those colors work together. And I'm really compelled by it. And I'm so grateful that I didn't paint it, with color picking. It would have been boring to me, I do so much realistic art. So this, again, still very realistic. It's just has some slightly abstracted color. And it reads well, and it reads nicely, and the light reads, and it's fun to look at. And it's a simple way to create some distinction with your work. And getting on to that point, a lot of new artists, or especially young artists, are looking for their style or their voice, that distinction. And I would much recommend, much more, just learn to be good than learn to be different. The different will come. Just like you don't have to learn to write your name differently or walk differently or laugh differently. It just happens. It'll happen in your work too. The things you'll select, how you'll render them, why you'll render them that way, the little distortions that happen in the way you perceive the world, the perspective problems, all those little things, they're you'll kind of work out the kinks, but there are things about you that are just you, and you won't be able to beat yourself out of your own artwork. You just won't. Your personal voice is there already, and it'll come. What you need to do is get familiar with the tools, and as you do that, get familiar with what's possible, and let your curiosity start to run wild. And when it does, it's going to take over. So hopefully you guys had fun with this one. Hopefully it was helpful. Thank you so much, and thank you especially to those who support on Patreon or support by liking and subscribing and all that stuff. Thank you so much. Best wishes. Take care.